Welcome to this session entitled Storytelling and Agency. I'm Akili, and as you may have noticed so far, I'm grappling with some flu, so you'll bear with my voice. Unfortunately, Stephen has put out, so we have got 3 presenters. We'll start with Tina, then Kayleigh, and we'll finish with Fouad. Is that okay? Great. Fine. So, without much ado, I think I'll leave it to Tina to start.
Okay, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really beginning this work only, so I'll be really interested in hearing what your contributions might be. So let me start. Is this now, or can I go on slideshow? How does this work? Okay, I can't see the thing now.
At the bottom.
Okay. Nice. And then how do I make it move?
Just click.
Right click, left click.
Right. Yeah.
And if I want to go back?
Click on the other side of the screen.
Oh gosh, I shouldn't have clicked now to test it out. No!
Click the other way.
There we go. Okay, great. So the conference topic, and in particular Thabi Singh Motsema's invitation to think about the contradictory and imaginative aspects of agency that women activate in contexts of oppression and coercion, made me turn to Fatema Mernissi's Dreams of Trespass, her memoir of growing up in a harem in Fez. Motsema encourages us to look beyond the grand, obvious and loud revolutionary gestures. Of course, she's not dismissing those, but she asks us to turn to the subtle forms of women crafting, and I'm using this verb advisedly. I won't get to the embroidery that plays quite a crucial role in this text as well, but I was thinking about that. Of women crafting pockets of resistance. To take seriously also and investigate the small, ordinary, everyday gestures of freedom, and to explore the nuances of the paradox of acquiescence and resistance. So these two don't exist in oppositional ways, but are actually often inextricably interwoven. And I think some of the panels yesterday were really exploring that already. Mernissi's memoir, Dreams of Trespass, Tales of a Harem Girlhood, begins with the words, I was born in a harem in 1940 in Fez, a 9th century Moroccan city some 5,000 kilometers west of Mecca and 1,000 kilometers south of Madrid, one of the dangerous capitals of the Christians. The problem with the Christian starts, said father, as with women, when the hudud or the sacred frontier is not respected. I was born in the midst of chaos, since neither Christians nor women accepted the frontiers. Right on our threshold, you could see the women of the harem contesting and fighting with Ahmed, the doorkeeper, as the foreign armies from the north kept arriving all over the city. For readers, this beginning might raise expectations of women breaking free of the restrictions of confinement, demanding to be able to cross the threshold of the front door. It is that too, but much more subtly. Mernissi uses the real physical boundaries she experienced growing up in this house in Fez to launch a nuanced interrogation of invisible boundaries that keep structuring women's lives even when they supposedly are completely free to move as they please. Actual limitations inherent in harem life become the grounds for honing skills of dissent that the women teach each other largely through storytelling, performance, and self-care, which result in a kind of psychological acumen. These strategies, I would like to argue, mark direct, albeit subtle forms of resistance to the constraining circumstances, even if they're not necessarily recognized or legible as feminist revolutionary acts. And I think, and this may be a thing for us to think about, also in relation to the keynotes, the text also implicitly reminds its readers that friendship and women's solidarity plays a key role in learning to look after each other. So that impossible demands that often seek to crush women's lives are held at bay when we remind each other to have fun, to dance, to stop, and to listen. And it's quite interesting because my impulse was, it's so difficult to think about those ways of honing skills of pleasure and self-care because they're so often denigrated as frivolous. So in fact my next section is this whole sketching of the political context in which the memoir is set and the kinds of way in which those very private domestic scenes actually play out in relation to the beginning of the Second World War, the nationalist drive in Morocco, the plight for independence. And then I realized that that section is actually so long, it is about to overwhelm precisely those kind of lived experiences of ordinary pleasure and a living out of desire that I wanted to talk about. So I'm actually resisting that impulse to try and say, okay, I have to make this a serious political academic analysis, and I'm gonna really jump immediately to the kinds of skills that I think the figure of Scheherazade, and hence the title, embodies for Fatema Mernissi, and the kinds of lessons that we might learn. And if this is frivolous, or if some of it sounds frivolous, then I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Why is this so difficult to claim, looking after one's skin as something that is additional, that is not serious, that doesn't do anything in the world. I think Mernissi is trying to teach us otherwise. But just very briefly, so I'm skipping the political context, about the harem. How do we need to imagine this harem? So it's a domestic harem, a single household of one family, and at the center of it lies a communal living arrangement. Though in her immediate family, the men only have one wife in that particular harem where she grew up. Mernissi tells us that her father and her uncle's families lived in the house under the sharp eyes of the paternal grandmother, who's one of the women who really actively polices the other women and who upholds tradition. Her own family comprises only 5 members, the parents and her 2 siblings. Her uncle's family numbered 9 people, their parents and their 7 children. The 4 salons around the central courtyard of the house are occupied by Lala Mani, the grandmother, the 2 families with the 4th one reserved for the men, which is the salon where the radio was kept. And of course there's much hilarity when the women get hold of the key for the room to play music and dance, and the men find out later that their room had been breached. Many female relatives who've fallen on hard times or were divorced by their husbands or in need of shelter have their living quarters on the higher floors. Men hardly ventured up there, and the terraces were largely the domain of the women, where they told stories, staged their performances, and administered the beauty treatments. There's another harem that Mernissi visits regularly, that of her maternal grandmother, Yasmina. This is located in the countryside and allows the women and children much freer movement than the city harem, in terms of physical movement, because it's, they're allowed to roam around. But Yasmina has 8 co-wives, so some of her freedoms of movement, she's renowned for climbing trees, horse riding, and staging a dishwashing party in the river, come with other more personal kinds of restrictions of arranging oneself in such a communal household. To Fatema, the difference of the 2 harems are unequivocal, until she understands more about internalized boundaries and rules, and I quote, "Yasmina's harem was an open farm, with no visible high walls. Ours in Fez was like a fortress. Yasmina and her co-wives rode horses, swam in the river, caught fish and cooked it over the open fire. Mother could not even step out of the gate without asking multiple permissions. And even then, all she could do was visit the shrine of Mulai Idris, the patron saint of the city, or her brother who happened to live down the street." And poor mother always had to be accompanied by other women of the household and by one of my young male cousins. So it did not make sense to me to use the same word for both Yasmina's and mother's situations. But whenever I tried to find out more about the word harem, bitter arguments ensued. You need only to pronounce the word and impolite remarks would start to fly. Samia and I discussed the matter and concluded that if words in general were dangerous, then harem in particular was explosive. So let me move. Okay, this is what I was hoping to cover. Let's get to this point. Storytelling is one of the ways in which the women practice freedom, claim freedom, and also nourish themselves. The figure of Scheherazade of the 1001 Nights becomes the model for this kind of clandestine rebellion. In a footnote, Mernissi inserts the following into a narration of how her mother uses the story of Scheherazade to teach young Fatema about the power of words. And I quote, "I was amazed to realize that for many Westerners, Scheherazade was considered a lovely but simple-minded entertainer, someone who narrates innocuous tales and dresses fabulously. In our part of the world, Scheherazade is perceived as a courageous heroine and is one of our rare female mythical figures. She's a strategist and a powerful thinker who uses her psychological knowledge of human beings to prevent King Shahryar from killing her. So she, unlike her father, was convinced that she had exceptional power. She would cure the troubled king's soul simply by talking to him about things that happened to others. She would take him to faraway lands to observe foreign ways so he could get close to the strangeness within himself. She would help him see his prison, his obsessive hatred of women." And of course, in the story cycle, this is precisely how it ends. 3.5 years later, after 1001 nights of storytelling, he declares that he's misunderstood women, that he loves her deeply, and that he's a reformed man who can show tenderness and caring. So what are the 3 skills Scheherazade, according to Mernissi, has to master? First of all, she has to master a lot of knowledge. She is very erudite. She is versed in literature, medicine, and philosophy. In order to be a storyteller who can really be captivating, you have to know your stuff. She also has to have the ability to grasp the addressee's mind, to disarm him by using dialogue. So the power of words to really assess the situation and to tell the right story for the right night so that she is not executed. And she must also not succumb to the fear so that she can remain clear-headed and control the interactions rather than being controlled by the circumstances. And what is very interesting is that for the young Fatima, Aunt Habiba, who's one of the poor relatives who's finding shelter in the upper stories of the house, becomes such a Scheherazade figure who teaches her a lot. She knew how to talk in the night. With words alone, she could put us into large ships sailing from Aden to the Maldives, or to take us to an island where the birds spoke like human beings. And then I'm skipping to the end. Her tales made me long to become an adult and an expert storyteller myself. I wanted to learn how to talk in the night. What is interesting is there's also a lot of drama performances that happen on the terraces. And for all the children, this happens usually on Friday nights, and for all the children, this is an anticipated evening where they sometimes get to escape the fairly strict routine of that communal life. And we see here the kinds of female figures that feature in these dramatic performances, and of course everybody is roped into them, as are the younger male cousins, to participate, to tell these stories. And one of her cousins is in charge, Chama, she's in charge of the performances, and we read that the heroines most often portrayed in Chama's theatre were Asmahan, the actress and singer, the Egyptian and Lebanese feminists, Scheherazade and the princesses of 1001 Nights, and finally important religious figures, and then we get some names. So it's also, I think Habiba has been asking throughout this conference this question of genealogy and the kinds of, wisdom that we're drawing on. And if we would trace the stories and the histories of these kinds of Arab feminist thinkers, we would build a very different kind of archive and genealogy as well. And I think Mernissi is inviting us to do that. I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time, I realize. So the importance of these inspirational historical women in the cultures of Islam cannot be overestimated, and I don't think it is far-fetched to suggest that the kinds of stories and the performances that Mernissi witnessed as a child really directly influenced her academic sociological work in Morocco. So books like The Forgotten Queens of Islam, but also much of her work is historical excavating of submerged stories of female agency that informs her academic work. And you can see how that storytelling, which seems in many ways part of entertainment, actually feeds directly into this kind of academic work. And I would argue that self-care is something that often can go out through the back door when the pressure of making it in a performance-driven, particularly for us here, academic environment, where competition deadlines, the pressure of marking and teaching often lead to burnout. And we can ask ourselves, why are women so often involved in caring for others but forget to care for themselves? And of course the ability to care for others often rests on trying to replenish one's own soul in order to be able to care for someone else. And what is very interesting to me is that the kinds of beauty sessions that the women have on the terrace are very much about this self-care, and they're loving descriptions, very detailed descriptions of the oils and the earths and the herbs and the spices and the fragrances that are mixed up into these secret clay masks that the women use. And I think it's quite interesting to think about, again, Aunt Habiba plays an important role here when she remarks that Aunt Habiba was convinced that if men wore beauty masks instead of battle masks, the world would be a much better place. And this idea of embodiment, of living in one's body, of not neglecting the body, and the relationship of the body to the world, I think is something that she draws our attention to. And of course the hammam, the bath, the weekly bath, yes, I am ending, is part of that, and I'm not going to read the quote. There's one thing that I want to end off with, and that is the care for the self then also relates to the care for others. And what is quite clear from the description is that the women in different ways really chafe against their entrapment, physical entrapment in the house. And you understand that even though she doesn't give it the word depression, there are severe bouts of depression that many of the women suffer from. And the way in which the other women then try and rally around the person who is, crying uncontrollably for days and days and days. And this idea of Hanan really intrigued me, which I'm ending off with. Hanan. The life upstairs was so much easier, especially since everything was also accompanied by Hanan, a Moroccan emotional quality that I rarely have encountered elsewhere. Hanan is hard to define exactly, but basically it is a free-flowing, easygoing, unconditionally available tenderness. So to conclude then, the cursory reading, which it was, of Mernissi's memoir shows that, and I'm using Mutsema's words again, while women inhabited and in some ways supported certain patriarchal structures that oppressed them, and they may not have been able to transcend those, this did not cancel the fact that they were simultaneously engaged in processes of resisting them. In other words, women show us how the very domains and institutions that act to oppress them can also become the very sites from which they remap enabling forms of power for themselves. So this idea of resistance and acquiescence completely interwoven. And I would say that Mernissi argues that key ingredients to this remapping are kindness, care, and storytelling, which allow women to craft patterns of solidarity that render the walls of the harem porous, even if not physically, and that teach a kind of psychological acumen that later comes to define Mernissi's impressive academic work as a North African feminist sociologist. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to Kayleigh.
So my paper is titled Dismantling Detective Gender Roles, the Potential of South African Feminist Crime Fiction in Angela Makholwa's Red Ink and H.J. Golakai's The Lazarus Effect. But for this presentation, for the sake of brevity, I will only be focusing on The Lazarus Effect. Feminist crime fiction is an emerging subgenre in post-apartheid South Africa. While crime fiction is largely dominated by male authors and male protagonists, The Lazarus Effect by Liberian author H.J. Golakai, which is set in Cape Town, is one text that can be considered an example of feminist crime fiction. The Lazarus Effect has been nominated 3 times for literary awards and focuses on Boenjama Johnson's search for a missing girl named Jacqueline Paulson. Feminist crime fiction is problematized by a number of critics for several reasons. Kathleen Gregory Klein asserts that the structural conventions of crime fiction follows the reader's vision of a safe and ordered world where criminals and women are put in their proper secondary places. Another common criticism is that the female detective figures that do exist embody too many male characteristics, which is borrowed from the hard-boiled genre. John Skaggs asserts that the term hard-boiled, meaning tough or shrewd, came to describe the hero that grew out of a type of detective fiction that developed in the United States in the interwar period. These characteristics included using traditional ideas of physical strength, intellect, and the ability to solve crimes through ratiocination. This later became the barometer to measure whether a detective was adept or not. In order for a crime fiction novel to be feminist, Klein suggests that all the female characters, whether they are ensemble or not, have to be multifaceted, rather than mere standard representations. In the cast of characters, representations of women should be replaced with a wide range of plausible women. The excuse of familiar stereotypes for formula fiction does not serve the needs of female-centered detective novels. Real women portraying authentic, lived experience are necessary. Besides the requirement for characters to be non-conventional and believable, Gavin suggests that the central concern of feminist crime fiction remains violence against women. Women are victims, captured, raped, murdered, butchered, and in the hands of forensic detectives, dissected into evidence. Thematically then, feminist crime fiction addresses issues that are relevant to women, such as physical or domestic abuse. This presentation examines to what extent the Lazarus Effect corresponds with the elements of feminist crime fiction that are outlined above. This analysis will focus on V, the other secondary female characters in the text, and examine whether the amalgamation of the traditional hard-boiled detective figure and the attractive female sleuth are wielded as a weapon against misogyny and patriarchy, or as tools to further perpetuate these systems. Utilizing Klein's arguments, I will evaluate the elements of a good female detective figure and whether Golakai's characters embody or lack this criteria. Additionally, this presentation will extrapolate on whether this novel thematically fits into the feminist crime fiction genre, with specific reference to the subjects of gendered violence, oppression, motherhood, and relationships. So, complex and self-contained, V is a remarkably likable character. Described as bitter but determined, she is introduced as feisty, evidenced by her vigorous attempts to exercise despite her difficulties breathing and her anxiety attacks. These seizures are precipitated by reminders of her past life with her partner, Titus Ray, but her romantic interests definitively take a backseat to V's job as a journalist. When V suddenly begins experiencing hallucinations or visions of a teenager in a red woolen hat, she discovers that these episodes are linked to the missing Jackie Paulson. She agrees to take on the story, despite the fact that the case is two years old and cold. But although Von Jama is highly independent, she is not opposed to working in a team. Chloe Bishop, her temporary assistant, while young, is revealed as extremely ambitious and hardworking. The fact that she's attractive, lesbian, and very sexually liberated lends a refreshingly honest tone to her character. Though they are an unlikely pair even aesthetically, the tall, dark-skinned West African woman and the short, milky, curly redhead, they work well on an intellectual level, and by the end of the novel are fast friends. Bless you. V is definitely a feminist detective figure, and proves this on numerous occasions within the text. Klein argues that female sleuths are often set up for failure in their novels because the texts themselves trace social reality, one that is decidedly skewed in the favor of the male sex. The predictable formula of detective fiction is based on a world whose sex or gender valuations reinforce male hegemony. Taking male behavior as the norm, the genre defines its parameters to exclude female characters, confidently rejecting them as inadequate women or inadequate detectives. While one can then consider that the genre's structural conventions disallow the possibility of progressive female characters, the Lazarus effect undoubtedly undermines and subverts this idea. The genre is conservative, but there are loopholes where authors can destabilize these so-called fixed strictures. The Lazarus effect acknowledges that there is a gendered hierarchy within the genre of crime fiction, but chooses to subvert it by depicting a strong female protagonist, a multiplicity of female characters, and through the portrayal of the male characters, which unusually fill more minor roles. Nevertheless, it should be noted that V does resemble many of the characteristics of the hard-boiled, masculinized detective figure. She is tough, skeptical, and works in an urban environment. Carolyn Helbrin articulates that these female sleuths are self-determined and do not kowtow to accepted romantic standards. These new women detectives prize their independence, offering no hostages to romance. Their living space remains their own, suited only to their needs. They do not put men first in their lives, but they are rich in friends, sometimes men, and in lovers, sometimes women. V conforms to the above description in that she lives alone in a small apartment with her borrowed dogman, Monroe. It is a simple existence, as evidenced by the minimum essentials that she keeps in her fridge: milk, water, leftover fragments of fried fish gravy, rice and sweet potatoes, bread and vintage lager, fresh salad ingredients. Besides her compact living space, V prioritizes her friends and her work over her romantic relationships. Her childhood spent as a refugee during the Liberian Civil War also ensures and solidifies V's ability to survive and fight even when the odds are against her. Judging from the manic look in her eye, there would be no stopping her until the stranger's head was a bloody mess. V's face was swelling rapidly, the imprint of metal ran along one side, and Chloe touched the hot flesh with a cool hand. V's ability to defend herself is satisfying for readers because her attacker's attack is unjustified, but also because it is refreshing to have a female character that does not need to be saved by someone else. When Ashwin surprises V outside her workplace, this is not only unprofessional but foolish. Joshua, V's love interest in the novel, is upset after this encounter, and the two argue. V retorts, "You want me to give up my job because it's dangerous? I should quit and sit down and be a pretty decoration because it's safer." This provocative statement counters Etienne Matonga's sentiment later on in the novel when he sees V at the Wellness Institute. "It's not a good job for a woman," he tells her. It is highly interesting that the two people that discourage V from endangering herself are both male. Joshua and Matonga's suggestion that V should quit imply that as a woman, she is unfit for the job. Golakai is suggesting that even though V exemplifies the hard-boiled female detective figure, in that she is capable of fighting back, she is still perceived as less than capable and equipped to handle a career that is only suitable for a man. Golakai's characterization of the other ensemble female characters is also quite exceptional. They all vary in personality, race, and ethnicity. Klein suggests that for a crime fiction novel to be feminist, both the content and the structural elements of the genre are required to be reconstructed. Consequently, this means that all the characters within the text, especially the women characters, need to subvert these stereotypical depictions. The women in the Lazarus Effect correspond with this requirement because they are both believable and interesting. Chloe Bishop overthrows the idea of a black female sidekick character in the text, and she is V's assistant. She's both visually and emotionally stimulating as a character, but it's interesting that when she applies for a job at Urban Magazine, she's willing to do anything to get the job, and this includes having sex with one of the managers, Mr. Cohen. And although she seems to feel guilty for this carpet interview, she's able to look at the situation with humor instead of the expected shame. The larger issue that is suggested here is that the working world in society is biased in the favor of men. Women are sometimes forced to put in more effort and labor into getting a job than they should. Golakai is arguably critiquing that in South Africa, having a qualification does not necessarily equate to receiving a job, a problem that is worse for a woman. One of the other peripheral characters that is also quite complex is Marika Venter, who is placed in the difficult position of a woman running a garage together with her typical colored trash brother Ashwin. Her work environment is toxically sexist, and she even has to hide the fact that she's having a sexual relationship with one of her colleagues, or else her brother will beat her senseless. Marika seems good-hearted and tries to help V, but her main intention is to clear her brother's name. But this backfires, and Ashwin is enraged and violently attacks his sister to punish her. The wall ran into Marika Venter, hard. At the same time, it is also clear that the everyday sexism that Marika has experienced has also been absorbed into her own mentality. This is proven when she sharply retorts that she asked for it, defending her brother's assault against Jackie. This kind of chauvinist rhetoric spewed from the mouth of another woman is appalling, but also understandable, considering the type of background Marika comes from. Marika's character thus functions as another example of the way even women have become turned against one another rather than uniting against discriminatory beliefs. The Lazarus Effect is also considered a South African crime fiction, feminist crime fiction text because of the way it articulates themes that are centrally concerned with women. Gavin outlines three main issues present in 21st century feminist crime fiction. Ensemble characters, issues surrounding motherhood and violence against women. While Golakai's ensemble characters are highly subversive and undermine stereotypical depictions, her text does also address the issue of both maternity and domestic violence. The two maternal figures within the Lazarus Effect are Karina Farid and Adele Paulson. The two share a lot of similarities and parallels. Both have lost children, both feel a strong sense of bitterness towards Ian, and both appear assertive and resilient women. Adele is a school teacher who seems to have governed Jackie with a stiff and sensible iron rod. A smoker with a small but extremely neat house, Adele is the model of a caring but hardened mother. Though she advises her daughter to stay away from her half-siblings, absent father, and the trouble embodied by Ashwin Venter, Jackie pursues her own path. It is heart-wrenching that Adele still cares for Ian, but understandable that she also blames him for the pain he put both her and his wife through. Karina, on the other hand, is totally consumed with grief over losing her firstborn son, Sean, to cancer. She has poignant insights on what motherhood entails, especially as a pediatrician, and reflects that she had never desired nor abhorred giving life to a child. It had simply never crossed her mind. However, like most modern women who thought themselves above the subservience of love, she hadn't made any allowances for how powerful would be her need to please her husband. Karina resents Adele for preventing Jackie from going through with the operation that could have saved Sean's life. A stellar doctor, Karina should be admired for her resilience and acceptance of her identity. If time had made her a graceless bitch, then so be it. She had never been one to run and hide from hard truths, and was willing to admit to her part in the saga. If she was a hag, then she had a fine male counterpart in her spouse. Golakai here provides us with an unpopular female character, but one that remains sure of who she is and of her place in the world. Therefore, while both Adele and Karina have a very hostile relationship with each other, considering the complicated circumstances that brought their lives together, they are both passionate individuals who love their children. They serve the function of portraying the conventional working mother while simultaneously disrupting and subverting this image. Ultimately, The Lazarus Effect fits the criteria of a South African feminist crime fiction novel. The text adroitly tackles a number of relevant and real issues that are pertinent in this country, the two most evident being missing children cases and gendered violence. Through a cast of diverse characters and voices, the narrative traces these issues and allows readers to empathize. V is interesting because she's not the perfect detective, although she is good at deduction, but she is psychologically flawed, which of course makes her a plausible and credible character. Klein contends that in order for a crime fiction novel to be feminist, the genre needs to undergo both formulaic and thematic reconstruction. This type of redesign is expressed in an exemplary manner throughout Golakai's novel. The author has created complex characters with different social positions, backgrounds, and personalities. While some of the characters in The Lazarus Effect are stereotypically attractive, like women in the hard-boiled genre, there is far more attention paid to substance, agency, and depth within the characters than their appearances.
Well, thank you for having me, and just a few words to frame this whole thing, which I hope is not going to be too disjuncted, because in the meantime, while preparing this talk, life happened kind of a lot. And so I had hoped to present something more conclusive. So the title of this talk is, as you see, Black Feminist and Mestiza Practice of Self-Disclosure, Writing about Art as a Dialogic Creative Process. A few words to frame this whole thing. Obviously, I appear here as a white, cishet person in a black feminist conference. And so I want to just mention that, and that is also part of my work of looking closer at the terms of engagement as a writer with artworks. And while thinking about this, I actually realized in a way you guys from the literature department also in a way engage with text, which is also artworks. And so I've been thinking about this, and that's where I want to actually go after this talk into more detail, hopefully. What makes you choose certain text? How do you when you choose a text to actually engage with it academically, how does that speak about yourself, and how do you speak through your own academic writing to that text? So by framing this, I wanted to also give you a quick idea of what I'm going to be talking about. So I will read some excerpts of my own writing. I've been working as an art writer for quite a while. I've been in South Africa for now more than 10 years, writing and working in the art field. And I realized there's lots of issues, especially in this country, which are actually exciting, challenging, and really problematic. And I will get into that during the talk. Maybe could you put the first slide? I want to read from an article which is currently about to be published in a publication coming up with the Fine Art Department, published by Charlene Khan, who is also my partner and co-conspirator, co-worker, let's say. And so this article starts with just like laying out, I hope in a more conclusive way, what my writing is about. And this paper, and I read only the intro, is called The Administration of Failure, Art Writing as Border Thinking. 10 years after the first publication of Doing It for Daddy in 2006 by Charlene Khan, I want to share reflections on art writing and what it means to write now and here about art, about artistic practices, and a short reminder, art writing, I will address anything from art journalism, art history, art criticism, based on conceptualist practices which actually demolish or which actually refuse boundaries between forms of writing and genres in that way that you say, oh no, this is now a journalist piece, or this is now a scholarly piece. And also actually refuse that they are meant for separate audiences. So art writing, and we go into detail in the text which is co-written with Charlene Khan and published in a publication currently in the Palgrave Handbook on Race and Arts in Arts Education called White Speak. That was closing the brackets. I've been living and working in South Africa for the same amount of time and experienced the urgency of questions which are raised by Shadin Khan in her article Doing It for Daddy, and want to use this occasion to further ask what does it mean to write about art and what can one achieve through one's writing. For those who don't know the text by Charlene, it is where she raises the issue of lack of transformation in the South African visual art world, where at that time, 2006, heads of art institutions were white women mostly. And so she raised it in 2006 and got lots of flack for that. She was not invited to group exhibition. She was not announced in many different platforms from art, from the classifieds to the announcement of her exhibition. And there was a silence around this discourse, which is for me coming from Germany, where we had a history also of silences around discourse, which was for me something I want to actually look at more closely. I continue with this text. Looking at my experiences in the field so far as an arts writer and editor, I want to also look at my attempts to change my own writing, elaborating and expanding complexities about writing as creative practice, as a dialogic space of discourse and tool of reflection and research. I want to ask, how can I find new perspectives towards my own writing, and how is it rooted in, informed by, and shaped by my own body, physical appearance, habituated life, lived experiences, socialization, political struggles, and particular histories. Growing up in Germany, I was socialized between my mom's German and my father's Palestinian families and languages. Living in between, I experienced the desire to engage with my father with his language and culture, while being ashamed of his imperfect German, sorry. My dad passed away and I didn't expect that to happen. Okay, this tension made me feel I need to prove myself, and I ended up learning about Arabic language rather than engaging in lived realities. I became an editor in German language to show that I am fluent in this language. Moving to South Africa and living with Shalim Khan, I began to interrogate my identity much more and the way I enacted certain Eurocentricisms and whiteness in my thinking. Sorry for that. This article is part of an ongoing exercise of reversing and healing through decolonial practice. I need not only to interrogate the position of the I which I write, but also to do a change in positionality when writing towards a decolonial internationalism. Here I will use the notion of border thinking, which was first developed by Chicana feminist and queer theory scholar and activist Glory Anzaldúa, which was published in 1987, so you see the cover on the left, who explored her own positionality as epistemic condition. Realizing the positionality, living as a queer Mestiza woman, her unruly language dismantles the colonial matrix of power by implicating her own body. Border thinking in Anzaldúa's work means to develop a Mestiza consciousness, which is, and I quote, to break down the subject-object duality that keeps her a prisoner and to show in the flesh and through her images in her work how duality is to transcend it. End of quote. Realizing the epistemic potential of lived experience means to displace colonial otherings to the margins, to live in between borders drawn by the colonial matrix of power and to create a third space from the inside, delinking from Eurocentric epistemic violence. In writing, one's positionality reveals the violence of discursive formations. While approaches to art writing are based on different lenses, concerns, and methodologies, they are also built on artistic practice, which historically aimed to expose underlying and disavows questions, intentions, and practices. In the context of South Africa, the work to analyze the double consciousness of white talk, in the words of Melissa Stein, 2005, needs to be distinguished from the option of borders thinking by Anzaldúa. The former strives to maintain white privilege, while the latter offers spaces of decolonial solidarity, which could become space of sharing. I keep trying to practice writing as a way of speaking slowly, editing and changing while moving along, but also as an interaction in a multi-vocal exchange known as discourse. This is not limited to the level of spoken and written work. It encompasses speaking and acting bodies, making meanings through social action, responding to and setting up topics in a field structured by economics and the power of social, cultural, and symbolic capital. Discourse, then, is not limited to written or spoken words, but includes the non-verbal. How is this of concern when writing about art? And if we look at performative events, how do we look at silently acting bodies as discursive actions? So this is kind of the framing for what I want to look at in this talk. And I came across recently this text which was published in collected essays published at the University of Texas, entitled Bridging How Gloria Anzaldua's Life and Work Transformed Our Own. And so Aida Wadado is a critical race scholar, also a Chicana activist from the south of the US. And so her work has been crucial in ways of critical race theory in using storytelling as a fables and storytelling in legal discourse. Maybe you know about the work of Derek Bell and other critical race scholars. So by creating stories like analogues, kind of or parables of their experiences, to make their experiences more approachable, more direct. So the power of narrative to actually make clear social constellations. And so in this text by Hurtado, Making Faces from Gender Barreras, the activist legacy of Gloria Anzaldúa, I want to read a little bit what she writes about disclosure of self. I don't know if you can read it. And so she quotes what has been for her so important from Anzaldúa. In her daily lives, we women of color strip off the mascara others have imposed on us, see through the disguises behind and drop our personas so that we may become subjects to our own discourses. We rip out the stitches, expose the multi-layered inner faces, attempting to confront and oust the internalized oppressions embedded in them, and we make anew both inner and outer faces. We begin to acquire the agency of making our own caras. Making faces is my metaphor for constructing one's identity. So in this text, Hurtado goes into detail on the question of self-disclosure as a political act of revealing your positionality and actually making clear that only through self-disclosure as a first step you can actually make real work, right? I'm not going to read these, which are rather important passages, because I want to continue with my questions, which I want to raise in this short talk. I hope it is short. So how can I make use of self-disclosure without recentering whiteness again? This is a well-known question, right? So how can I actually speak and not make it about myself, and that which has been already kind of hegemonic? And then the next question would be, if self-disclosure and positionality are performative, which is also, which many other writers, but which I find very persuasive, explained by Sarah Ahmed in her text Declaration of Whiteness, the non-performativity of anti-racism. The question would be, can art writing be seen as a creative practice that could turn into a performative artwork? So how do we as art writers, or how do I as an art writer actually perform something, or perform through the text I write? And there I came then to the question of the role of narrativity. So because the narration of stories is a different thing, and if I narrate about myself or around where I come from, things get more complex, they get messy, and it's less that kind of white talk, which we also have analyzed. If you see in the bottom, this is the text I wrote with Shani Khan, or she wrote with me better, Right Speak, How Race Works in South African Art Criticism. And I want to read just a little bit from a text which I wrote on a performance by Skumbuzo Makholwa, who is also present at this conference. I have how many minutes left? 5 minutes, thank you. And so Skumbuzo did kind of a, how would you say, an exorcism at the cathedral in Grahamstown. And that was at the same conference, doing it for that in 2016. So he started burning things, and one part of his performance which really struck me was he went with, so he's clothed in a cassock, which is this Roman Catholic garb, and that hat, and then he went to the audience, and he went to the white people in the audience and rang the bell in their ears, right? So he has this bell. And I think like, so Skumbuzo, you are doing this to me, so what does it do to me? And how do I, if I write about that performance, how do I respond, right? And so you see here Skumbuzo with his, that is the, basically the photo documentation for his performance. I shot a few photos myself, so there you see he prepares this bowl where he's going to burn the cassock because he changed it to the black one. And so there it is burning already, and then he starts to ring the bell. And later he goes on to the Drosti Arc where he puts up a rope, and the audience members were handed Molotov cocktails. They were not lit. But that was an interesting thing because actually by the law of proximity, we could have been those with the Molotov cocktails already, I mean, just being there without even the Molotov cocktail. So it was a very strong movement. So I want to read from my response, which is a very long one, and I want to read just a few parts of it, just to give you an idea, and also to see if it works. So what I did is, I did an imaginary interview with Skumbuzo, where I said, okay, now you are ringing the bell, and so how do I respond? So, question. Your work is rooted in a reflection of the political implications of art and artistic research. How does this appear in your current work, Skumbuzo? One apparent instance is this interview, which only takes place in your head. Question, could you elaborate that? Skumbuzo, I'm still trying to figure out what it means that this interview never took place. I never said any of these words and will never utter any of them. The whole interview takes place entirely in your imagination, right? Yes. So why you don't even deny it, I need to ask why you write, so this is now Skumbuzo, so why you don't even deny it? I need to ask, why do you write this imaginary interview at all? It's not acceptable to speak over and on behalf of any artist. What kept you from asking me for a meeting, for an interview, or to ask me if I'd respond to questions you would send by email? If this fails, we could have had a phone or Skype conversation where you could have presented your questions. I don't understand why you choose to speak over me and my work. Question. Wouldn't you agree that any write-up of an interview, even a closed transcript of a conversation to a certain extent, speaks over and distorts the spoken dialogue? You could never capture the context of the interview, the digressions, misunderstandings, repetitions, or not so interesting passages, which will be edited out anyway. Skumbuzo. I want to engage in this kind of hair-splitting. I will take over now. I see what you're doing, a cunning attempt to reenact the exclusions of black artists in the writing of art history of South Africa. In the words of Akili Envisor, you are trying to grapple with, quote, what happens when suddenly the narrative of white representation of Africans are challenged by a black counter-narrative that seeks to exclude how African subjectivity has been positioned by and within white South African narratives, end of quote. This imaginary interview is an attempt to invent issues around the form of a transcribed interview to retain the ventriloquism of white art history writing. Here I find your choice of an imaginary interview a bit simplistic. I acknowledge that you sent it to me beforehand and that you asked me to insert whatever I wanted and to change both my own imagined utterances, as well as your questions. However, finding the text written out and this idea of yours about situating the text in the future and reflecting on the past along with the line of thoughts which we developed and which seem real enough, I struggle to find the beginning and end of imaginary dimensions of this talk. Sure, there are a few strands of conversation and exchanges of ideas we've had before, and they merge quite easily with the invented arbitrary fragments of the dialogue. That's why I find it rather problematic when my own alleged thoughts are written down and printed, rather than reenacted by someone else, for instance. To speak this imagined conversation is not the same as writing it down. And look at you, you are now even putting these invented words of contention in my mouth, and even if they make the audience think, it does not change the fact that this interview never happened. Question. I hear what you're saying. On the other hand, I found myself hijacked by your performance and the imaginations it evoked. They unravel in my head quite independently when I see your performance. So would it be possible to say that this discussion is part of your work to some extent at least? No, I don't think so. You also have to be aware that your imagination is based on your white Western sociogyny. You are not considering that by asking imaginary questions about the past in the future that did not happen yet, you not only summon the violence of memory, which is not yours, but also on false premise. Inserting your own imaginations irons out the complexity of what I'm addressing in my work. When you raise issues which you see in my work, for example, the question of cattle land and personhood, in the relation to the non-Kwause prophecy, sorry for the mispronunciation, these became vacuous on so many levels. At the same time, you're a public person, and as an artist, you always face the situation of being spoken for and about. Skubuzo, no doubt I keep reflecting on how to negotiate and present my work publicly. I keep control over my voice and over the way how it is read. And my work aims to expose unexpressed premises in the discourse about art. To make use of memory and imagination as resistance is a black project that has now become appropriated by white imagination, and we find ourselves reassembled in the minds of writers who have not experienced in their lives what it means to speak through one's own skin. And I'm not talking about imagined skin. White skin is both property and attribute, and in its transparency superimposes itself over any color. In my work, I claim this space and its focus on the black episteme. What you write in this text is and remains your own business. So I had a kind of an unforgiving interview partner there. The interview continues, and I'm in the process of sending it back and forth with Skubuzo and see where this could go. So this is one of the attempts of thinking how could you think border thinking, self-disclosure, and actually negotiate issues which also the discourse on art kind of is reluctant to address. So thank you for your attention.
All right, we have got 15 minutes for questions and comments. So I think we'll take 3 at a time. So,
sorry, Kitty, just to clarify, we've got 15 minutes till the next session.
What do you mean?
When is the tea break?
Tea is now.
Okay.
Till 12.
Oh,
I know we're running behind, but the other sessions are trying to keep on time, so perhaps we could just have a very short question answer.
Okay, fine. Questions? Comments?
Can I ask a question? I don't know. Am I jumping in the queue?
No.
Fouad, I was so intrigued by your presentation, and actually, I thought yours was one Kayleigh was wonderful as well. I wanted to ask you, so I don't know if I caught that correctly at the end. So have you sent it? Is there a dialogue happening about this dialogue?
Yes.
And what is the response?
Well, I get these smiles from Skubuzo, but because I keep sending it to him and I say, we need to talk. And he's like stalling, I think. So it is still in process, but I'm still wanting to find a strategy of actually seeing if he agrees to publish it with his work.
Okay.
I enjoyed all of the papers, and because I've had breakfast the last 2 days with Tina, I've pretty much discussed a lot of her paper. But I have a question. This Hanan you were talking about, do you see any parallels to that in the Western culture?
think there is a strand of that's been hidden more and more, I think, through the Enlightenment and the kind of capitalist liberal economy in which the individualism is pushed more and more and more. But I think there's a real strand which saw kindness and care as a virtue, you know, where kindness is not something that you need to hide and mask, but that is actually as something to be cultivated. And in fact, acts of kindness also give us a lot of pleasure, you know. To be kind to someone makes us feel good about ourselves, and a lot of philosophers have reflected on that. But I think it has kind of gotten into a space of disrepute, you know, because it's seen as weakness, it's seen as I don't know, it's not rewarded in society in the same way that it might have been. Also because, of course, you know, kindness is often tied to particular religious practices. In this case, it was Islam, but of course you find it in other religions as well. And as societies become more secularized, then again, you know, the kinds of perhaps that could just be cultural traits of a kind of religious legacy are also effaced more and more. But I think, you know, there is some writing by psychologists and other writers that kind of say we have to reactivate this. But it's interesting to me because in a South African context, I find as an outsider living here, I'm always astounded by the resources of kindness that people have despite the history of oppression. And maybe it's actually, see, I'm really trying to think about this, whether, you know, the link between kindness and suffering, but I don't want to say too much because I haven't explored it yet, and it can also be really problematic. Yeah.
So I have another question from the second presenter. That title, The Lazarus, what is it?
The Lazarus effect.
What is that? What's behind that?
The Lazarus effect is actually a process of restoration, I think.
So it's from the story when Jesus called Lazarus out the grave?
I think it's more a medical reference, actually. It's a process that a corpse takes, I think. I'm not quite clear on the...
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
And my last question to the last presenter, not a question. I enjoyed that. that was really good, and my condolences to the loss of your father. And that was refreshing to have a presenter in an academic conference be a movement and actually portray that emotion. So I appreciate that. And I'm done. Give me my popcorn.
Is that a hand?
No, sorry.
Yeah.
I have also just like a very short question. I wanted to ask Tina, what made you choose the Mernissi? And I wanted to ask Kayleigh how, like, okay, maybe it's what are your favorite female kick-ass detectives? And what is the equivalent of the hard-boiled, you know, the one smoking, being like black and white, Humphrey Bogart type? Like, what that's like the so how would you think is how do you approach this as an interest also in your own reading?
Thanks for the question, Fouad. It's actually quite difficult to answer because I was thinking about the keynotes and the role in which mothers and grandmothers have, you know, shaped people's academic trajectories. And I think for me coming here as just out of school from Germany also, and trying to find a way of research and academic work that would also allow me to find a place here doesn't allow me to activate the sense of the filial, right? It's actually quite a rupture. So I would like to think of coming to this work, okay, so most of my work is actually on East African Anglophone writing, and Islam plays a very big role in that. So I was really intrigued, and I was trying to find women writers, Muslim women writers from Eastern or Northern Africa, because of course, to look at their work. And I think it's actually been a process of affiliation, of trying to constitute a different kind of archive, even though I have not inherited it and I can't claim it as my own. There's no grandmother, aunt, or mother who's handed this to me, and I quite consciously didn't want what my grandmother and mother and aunts handed me. I've allowed myself to be affiliated, and yeah.
So just to clarify, you were asking me what my favorite strong female detective figures are, and...
So both in fiction, cinema, like in popular culture?
Oh, in popular culture as well.
Yeah, like in general.
Okay. So, it's a children's story though. It's for younger kids, but I used to really enjoy Nancy Drew. As a child. And I think what was so interesting is that a lot of the other books that I was reading at that age had boys as the strong, rough and tough kids, and Nancy Drew is something to aspire to be, you know. She had her little car and she drove around, and her father was also kind of really supportive as well in her profession. And I found that their relationship was very interesting, because from what I had read at that stage, I hadn't encountered that kind of parental father-daughter relationship. But maybe that was my own lack as well, personally. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Yes.
So my question is for Tina, and it's about theory, the theoretical question. I just wondered if you could maybe just tease out a little this paradox of acquiescence and resistance. As you know from my own paper, that is interesting to me. So I suppose what I'm asking you is, what is the relationship between acquiescence and resistance? How do they coexist? You know, the simultaneous protest and resistance. Is acquiescence a form of resistance? So I'm just trying to understand the relationship in all of its complexity. That's such an excellent question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer yet, because I'm beginning to think about this only, but is acquiescence... Well, I suppose part of acquiescence is to recognize that some battles you are going to lose if you were to want to fight them. And in some ways then, what are the kinds of forms of resistance that you can take without making your life impossible? So I think it's kind of also perhaps an act of deferral to say, okay, so I cannot cross the threshold of getting past Ahmed, the doorkeeper. Though some of the younger women actually jump from one terrace to the neighbor's terrace and get out of the house that way. But it doesn't carry the same kind of status to do this, because you do it clandestinely, and you do it, you're not walking past Ahmed the doorkeeper, which is what you want to do, but you can't really do. So then, but in the stories, so there's one story that is the favorite story then, which is the woman with wings, which is the woman who does transcend the door. And of course, it's also a matter of time, because the women in this harem, this harem does disintegrate, through the Declaration of Independence and through the young cousins all getting an education and going to university, as Fatema Mernissi does. But I actually think I'm not answering. I realize I'm not answering your question properly, and I will have to think about it more.
We'll need to check.
Yeah, because I was like consequential. What was it? Consequential complicity. I was so intrigued by that term. I was like, gosh, I wonder if that's if this is a way of thinking about
Yes,
this.
I think they're related.
Yes.
So it's an invitation.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Just a comment rather than a question. Particularly for the last paper, the point that you make about recognizing subjective positioning in the reading of text, but in any kind of research, I imagine, versus the worry of reinscribing whiteness or one's own value system. I think that's just something that I'm taking away and sort of encouraging everybody to think about, because what it means for myself as a white academic as well to be doing work on an other, whether it be race or age or location or across time, and to think about how I can then do that and speak for somebody else in research. So it's just really a comment.
Yeah, if I had more time, there's also something like what I realize and recognize is that people who don't even know your work, don't know your culture, like complete strangers, can have often in the art field super interesting comments, right? And so that's actually something which is, especially in the visual art field performance, where artists often have a good radar for this kind of, like misunderstandings or some observations which don't come from the circle of those, like who know or you work with. So I think these kind of things I would also like to really tease out a bit more and to see like where do you, I think it's this thing, how much do you extend an artwork by writing on it, and how much do you actually co-work or propose a collaboration or do some form of involuntary collaboration, these kind of questions.
Any questions or comments? If not, I think we can break off.
Tea.
Quick one, and I don't know.